You're listening to the Common Fan Podcast, a Husker football podcast for the common fan, by the common fan.
Welcome back to the Common Fan Podcast. We are your fellow common fans. I am TJ Burkle alongside Matty Owens Sr. Geoff in Lincoln is unable to join today. We don't know what he's doing, but he's probably off watching old Lou Holtz speeches or thinking about how long it's been since Notre Dame actually won anything. Reminder that the Common Fan Podcast is now fueled by Certified Piedmontese Beef. Certified Piedmontese is premium Nebraska beef raised by Nebraska ranchers, grazed on vast pasture land in the beautiful Sand Hills region of the state, and powering the Husker football team. Make sure to swing by your local Mercado Butcher Shop in Lincoln at 30th and Yankee Hill or at 84th and Havelock. There's also one in Omaha at 162nd and Maple. If you don't live in Lincoln or Omaha, fear not. You can go to cpbeef.com to get certified Piedmontese products shipped right to your front door. Guys, I grilled up some ribeyes just last night. I'm telling you, you're going to want to check out your local Mercado Butcher Shop or visit cpbeef.com for this premium Nebraska beef, which is fueling the Husker football team and fueling the Common Fan Podcast.
Yes.
We are honored to be joined today by veteran Pac-12 reporter John Canzano. For 20 years, he was the lead sports columnist at the Oregonian newspaper. He now writes his column at johncanzano.com and also hosts the Bald-Faced Truth sports talk radio show daily from 3 to 6 p.m. Pacific time on 750 The Game. I highly recommend you check him out, Husker fans, with the 4 Pac-12 teams about to join the Big Ten. He is definitely one you'll want to follow. So find him on Twitter. Check out johncanzano.com for other great content. And you can also stay up to date by signing up for his newsletter, which I highly recommend. I myself am a subscriber. John, thank you so much for joining the Common Fans today.
Well, thanks for subscribing and reading. I'm having a lot of fun with it, and there's never been, I think, a more exciting and mercurial time to talk college football and dive into that stuff. It's been wild the last, couple of years. I've been doing this for like 35 years. I've covered the Big Ten before. I covered the Big Ten in the late 90s and as a beat reporter. And I just think college football is completely off the rails, and there's a lot of it that's turning fans off, but you need to know what's going on if you're going to be a fan today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would love to get into some of your thoughts on that. It kind of leads us to our first question. I mean, you've been around the Pac-12 a long time. Kind of curious, what do you think the mood is in Duck Country, in Husky Country with the LA schools? How are folks feeling about this jump to the Big Ten, which even though it was kind of a slow burn and happened over many years, it felt kind of sudden when it all finally happened. And so, kind of curious how the fan bases are feeling about it, how the universities are feeling about it, athletic departments, whatever, leadership of the universities, fan bases, et cetera.
Yeah, well, the athletic directors had a big meeting in Chicago just a couple of weeks ago. And, I spoke to a couple of them after going. And, I think they're all forward thinking. They have to be. It's kind of like I don't know. When I was a kid, I used to jump off the side of the pool. And my friend had a cold pool. I knew it was going to be cold, but I knew we eventually would warm up once we got in and swam around a little bit. I kind of think like the teams that are going into the Big Ten are having that feeling right now because, they're excited about the football part of it, and football drove this decision. The baseball program, the volleyball program, softball, basketball, they're all getting dragged along with all of these decisions that are getting made nationally. And so I think the athletic directors are very focused on football, but they're also, I think, coming to a sobering realization that it's impacting a whole bunch of their athletes. There's some costs that maybe they didn't plan on having. They lost the lawsuit with Oregon State and Washington State as they were all departing. The 10 departing schools are going to have to pay $6.5 million each to Oregon State and Washington State. Plus, they're giving up all these assets. And so I think there's a financial hit there that has been an impact. But from a football standpoint, Oregon's going into the Big Ten. I think Oregon believed all along it could compete and contend. It is recruited at the top of college football in the last cycle. Its NIL collective is one of the top 3 collectives in the country. It's got Nike backing it. I think Oregon feels like it's in a good position. And then Jim Harbaugh leaves Michigan. Ohio State, some of the shine has come off there. Suddenly people here are starting to think about Oregon as a contender this season in the Big Ten.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I think the other schools, USC, I think, is also excited about the football part of it. I'm not sure about UCLA. I think, they'll compete in basketball, but I don't see UCLA as more than about a middle of the pack, Big Ten school in football on a perennial basis. And then, you've got Washington undergoing a coaching change. It's less than ideal as they're transitioning into the conference. Is that a 7 or 8 win team? Probably in year 1. So I think there's a lot of mixed feelings. There's a lot of, tentacles to the other schools and the other sports going into the Big Ten. But I think by and large, the average Pac-12 fan of those 4 schools is excited about seeing Ohio State and Michigan in particular playing at their stadium.
Absolutely.
USC is probably going to want to relearn how to tackle before they come to the Big Ten next year.
Yeah.
True.
John, this past fall, I kind of feel like the Pac-12 has had one of their better seasons in recent memory. At least the top half of the conference seemed to be pretty formidable, at least. Which programs do you believe are most ready? You just talked about Oregon and mentioned UCLA. I guess, who other than Oregon, do you think there's anybody else that you think will be kind of maybe competing in at least in that top 4 or 5?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because USC has just, it's such a brand when it comes to football, but they've been underwhelming in the last decade. You look at the Clay Helton era and then, even Lincoln Riley this last season, it was just really underwhelming to see the reigning Heisman Trophy winner, and they knew they had defensive problems the year before, and that defense came back even worse. And so, I think USC is interesting. I think Big Ten fans are going to be excited to see the Trojans at their stadium. Oregon's certainly a brand. Washington's going to invest in football. They'll continue to invest. But I think that coaching transition, we've all seen that. Nebraska fans know better than anybody, what that turnover, even if you think you got somebody who can help you win, that turnover it derails your momentum. And, this funny thing that I heard over and over, even as Oregon was looking at potentially moving to the Big Ten, was I heard the refrain, "We don't want to be Nebraska," over and over. And I think it's really interesting for your viewers, your listeners in particular, to kind of examine, what mistakes were made in that transition. How did Nebraska lose its national recruiting edge or its advantage? If hindsight were 2020, would Nebraska have been better off in the Big 12? I think those are all things that are in the back of the minds of all 4 of those schools as they're heading off to the Big Ten. Because, it's like the words of Bill Moose ringing in their ears saying, careful what you wish for. Because if you're not equipped to compete, it's not just that it's the Big Ten that I covered in the 90s and people knew that was physical and we saw them in Rose Bowls and in my childhood. It's that the whole landscape of college football has changed. And the Big Ten is, it's the AFC or the NFC, essentially, the SEC and the Big Ten, and everybody else is fighting for scraps. So, if you're not funding your NIL collective, if you don't have an angle, you're in trouble because you're just joining Purdue and Northwestern and Iowa fighting for the middle of that conference. And, I covered Purdue as a beat reporter. Drew Brees was the quarterback at Purdue when I covered him. It was a different conference then. And that conference wasn't used to seeing spread offenses. Brees was throwing the ball around the stadium. Joe Tiller was the coach. Now everybody's running it. And guess what? Ohio State and Penn State and Oregon are going to have, the better recruits. So you've got to have an angle and an NIL collective that is particularly focused on retention of your young players that you've developed.
Absolutely.
Well, that's fascinating, and that hurts a little bit, but I appreciate you sharing with us, John.
I know. It came up though. I'm not going to lie to you. It came up, and I was told by somebody at Oregon, they said they examined Nebraska. They looked at Nebraska's transition and they said Nebraska made mistakes. Now, I haven't dove into what those mistakes are, but Nebraska fans are probably raising their hand right now going, hey, it was this, and this. Yeah. But I think, we're in this collective world. Oregon's got the collective. They've got Nike. I think they feel pretty good. USC probably feels pretty good. UCLA and Washington have to be a little anxious about their first season.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, we won't go down the side road, but I think there were a lot of mistakes made, from the chancellor on down over the various years. I think there was an adjustment to the Big Ten that maybe threw us off track a little bit, but I would contend to my grave that it never needed to get as bad as it's gotten.
No.
So anyway, we won't start playing the violin on that. And Husker fans will tell you we're on the way back. So we're always on the way back. So just 2024 is the year.
Yeah.
But there was already what I agree with what you said at the beginning, in that we're losing some of what made college football great, and some of the changes are maybe not, maybe we'll look back in 10 or 20 years and say these are not for the best. But sort of the flip side, if you look at some of the things that are exciting about this, is I think there's a lot, especially if you have a seat at one of the two big conferences. If you have a seat at one of the good tables, there's a lot to be excited about. So, Nebraska, I think about just Nebraska. We've got history with UCLA. We've got history with we've got history with all four of these schools. We played Washington, USC over the years, Oregon more recently. We split with them during the Riley era. So are there any matchups like you're really excited to see? I know you mentioned everybody's kind of gunning for Ohio State and Michigan, or like, do you think there's anything that kind of has the potential to develop into a solid rivalry for whatever reason?
Yeah, and I think that you're always interested in that stuff. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how Oregon is viewed in particular as it comes into the conference, because it was viewed in the Pac-12 in a negative light by a lot of the other members who said, hey, we don't have a Phil Knight, we don't have a Nike backing. In a lot of ways, there was some snarkiness that developed towards the Oregon fans in that program in particular. People making fun of the logo. Oh, that's how many national titles you've got, right? It's the same thing. So I think it'll be interesting to see how much of that the Big Ten fan bases pick up on. I also just think I'm really interested in that core group, because, the strength of a conference, we talk about the top teams all the time. We talk about the teams that are playoff contenders. And certainly you talk about the Big Ten, you're talking about Ohio State, you're talking about Michigan, maybe Penn State to some extent. Nebraska has been lost a little bit in that. And it's interesting because I think there's only two things you really sell if you're a program. You can sell proof of performance. Nebraska's got it. And you can sell hope. And you're talking what you guys were just talking about. There's some hope there. So Nebraska's got something to sell there, but they're in that meaty group that's in the middle of the conference right now. And I'm looking at that group and I'm going, where do these four teams in the Pac-12 fit? Because prior to Jim Harbaugh leaving, or maybe Ohio State looking a little vulnerable this last year, I kind of thought the Pac-12 teams would all be in that middle group and find it harder to compete. But I just think there's just been a little bit of attrition in the Big Ten. And I'm just curious to see if the NIL, are we just going to line up the collectives and that's how the standings are going to go? Or are we going to see some separation with coaching like we used to see in the old days? So I'm curious about the middle of that conference, because I think the Big Ten has the potential to get 3 or 4 teams in the playoff in a great year. And, so does the SEC. Let's see how that plays out. And then let's not forget, guys, in the background of all of this, Florida State is suing the ACC. Oregon State and Washington State are sitting off to the side going, we're not sure if we're going to have to rebuild, because college football could implode again. And we could find that there's another reshuffling. And, if you're a Nebraska fan, you're probably happy you're in the Big Ten because you're already with the haves. Because I think the Big 12, the ACC, Oregon State, Washington State could be fighting over, hey, who are the best 16 teams and where do they belong? And that's what the future of college football looks like. So I do think it's important in this next 4-year cycle that, everybody's got to be investing in football, because the question may come here in 3 or 4 years, who belongs in major college football? And you don't want to be Northwestern, who has always been at the bottom of the Big Ten. So they're going to invest. So is everybody. Purdue, Indiana, Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska. Everybody's got to invest, because there's a little bit of a beauty pageant that's going to happen here if there is an implosion.
Yeah, for sure. You bring up a great point too, John. At least for me, of just not just a Nebraska fan, just a college football fan in general, I always kind of view a conference, how tough or how good a conference is, and how good is the middle of the pack, right? Like that's why we mentioned the Pac-12 this past season. You've got Arizona now had a pretty good, decent year. Oregon State had a pretty good year. They're not who you automatically think of, who the top 2-3 teams in that conference, but that lends itself to as a whole, how good is that conference, right? So that's a great point. So John, I'm kind of a stadium geek. I love football stadiums, baseball stadiums, all of them. Comparing them, especially to what we have here. Which Big Ten stadiums are you most excited to visit, and why is Nebraska at the top of the list?
Nebraska's a great stadium. And look, I always judge the stadium. Sure. I walk into the stadium like you guys do. It's hours before the game, or maybe I'm there late and you see it empty. And there are just some stadiums that are more striking than others. But I always look at the fan base too, and how do they show up? And I think that's where Nebraska gets a big edge. I mean, I've walked into that Rose Bowl parking lot when Nebraska was playing for the national championship, and the Oregon fans were all upset that Nebraska was even there. And it was a sea of red going into that stadium. Like I've been to Lincoln, and but I've seen all the Big Ten stadiums. And I just think, I think Oregon fans were excited a few years ago. They got to go see a game at Michigan. It was like, circle that on the calendar. Now they're kind of going, hey, we might get to go there every third year or so. And now that's, I've never been to Happy Valley. That's one place I like to go see a Penn State game.
Yeah.
And see, sort of the atmosphere at Penn State. But I think it'll be a little eye-opening too for some of the Big Ten fans to see the the LA Coliseum and USC. And will fans show up at UCLA and fill the Rose Bowl for a Big Ten game? They weren't doing it for Pac-12 games on a consistent basis. So I think there's a lot of that too. But I think part of the charm, with a lot of the schools is I enjoy going to college towns. Seattle's not a college town, so you're not going to get that experience going to a Washington football game, but you certainly get to see a big city, and it has a distinct, flavor and vibe to it with the Pike Fish Market and the Space Needle and some landmarks and stuff like that. But I think it'll be really interesting to see kind of, do Big Ten fans travel to Autzen Stadium to check out Oregon? I know some Nebraska fans came for that game there that last time, but, I just think it adds a little novelty that we haven't seen. And, maybe that's a good byproduct of everything that we're watching. But I do worry about the lost rivalries and traditions and what happened to college football, as Keith Jackson called it. And I think that was a real casualty of what we saw. And, I watched the NFL games, the playoffs, as everybody did, and I thought, gosh, I hope the college game doesn't feel like this. It really needs to feel like something different.
Yeah, 100%.
Totally agree. I can tell you Nebraska fans will show up at UCLA games. I don't know about UCLA fans, but I can tell you Nebraska fans will show up.
Especially if we're playing them in November.
Exactly.
Leave Nebraska in November to go out to LA. It doesn't sound like too bad of a deal.
We're at USC on November 16th this year, so I think everybody's got that circled probably on the calendar.
Yeah.
And John, you mentioned kind of the situation with Oregon State and Washington State in particular. Our old friend Trent Bray, who was a former Nebraska linebackers coach, is now the head coach at Oregon State. What's going on with those two exactly? I know they kind of won their lawsuit against the Pac-12, and in the short term, they're kind of they're supplementing their schedules heavily with Mountain West teams. But like, what is their desired end game? Like, what do they like want? Obviously they don't want to become part of the Mountain West, I would guess. So what do they want to see? And what is that in line with what's most realistic?
Yeah, they obviously wanted to be included with what happened, and they were not, and they were devastated by that. And those two schools were the only two Pac-12 schools that actually signed the grant of rights before that meeting and that day where the conference imploded. They signed the night before. They didn't have other options. They knew it. And it's not their fault. Like, Oregon State has competed under Jonathan Smith at the top of the conference in the last few years. They're one of the better football programs at that time. And they found themselves left out simply because they didn't have the media market. Corvallis, Oregon, and Pullman, Washington, you're not going to move the needle from a media standpoint. And unfortunately, Oregon State did not have the brand that Oregon had, with Nike backing it and Phil Knight. Oregon just sort of elevated itself over the last 20 years, and we all know it. And so they got left out, and obviously they're disappointed. They ended up, long story short, they won that lawsuit. They got a settlement. They will split $255 million in future revenues and assets. So they have a war chest. But there's a real thought right now that they may not need to invest and rebuild in the old-fashioned way that we have all seen conference realignment happen. And so they're rubbernecking a little bit on that Florida State ACC story, just to see if, like, if Florida State wins that, and I don't think they will, but if they do, grant of rights don't exist. And so all of a sudden what you're going to see is the ACC implode, the Big 12 implode, and you're going to see a free-for-all. And so Oregon State and Washington State want to be prepared for that option. So they are saying they're going to continue to fund those football programs and basketball programs like their Power Fives. So that's plan A. They're just going to fund. They're going to use that $255 million. They're going to play this next season, like they're a Mountain West Conference affiliate member. They've got 6 or 7 games each against the Mountain West. But Oregon State went out and negotiated. It had a pre-existing game with Purdue at home. It's got Oregon at home. They've got a couple of games there that they could potentially sell from a media rights standpoint. And they're going to try to backdoor the playoff. Like, they're going to try to fight their way and punch their way into that 12-team playoff as an at-large. And I think they think that the selection committee will view them as a Mountain West or better team because of the schedule that they're playing. But we all know that if you continue to play Mountain West games over several years, you suddenly are a Mountain West Conference team, and you may have some problems recruiting at that point. So this is a short-term deal. Really, I looked at the contract this morning. It's a 1-year deal that really ends in the summer of 2025 with the Mountain West. They can extend it to be a 2-year deal. But I don't think Oregon State and Washington State foresee playing this kind of arrangement beyond maybe 2 years, 1 to 2 years of having to play in the short term as they evaluate the landscape. I mentioned the possibility of the ACC implosion. They're going to keep one eye there. I think the other eye is on the 10 departing schools. And I think they're going to say, hey, anybody have buyer's remorse? Anybody have second thoughts? I think it's really interesting to note that Oregon State and Washington State did not take the flamethrower out and did not torch those 10 departing schools. They were upset. They were disgruntled, but they have maintained a good enough relationship with their rivals, even, who ditched them, that they're going to play them next season. So that to me was interesting. They've left the door open, should geography end up winning out, and should the 4 or 5 of the departing schools go, this isn't penciling for us in these other sports, it's not working, we need to come home. If that happens, I think Oregon State and Washington State have open arms. Now, maybe it's 1 or 2 schools. Maybe Stanford and Cal say, this just doesn't work for us. They come back. I think at that point, there are some Mountain West schools that Oregon State and Washington State would pick off. I think they're interested in San Diego State, Boise State, Fresno State, Colorado, UNLV, Air Force, that group, maybe San Jose State because of the Bay Area media market, but I don't think they really want to get too heavy into the Mountain West. So ideally, you'd take like 2 Mountain West schools, you'd take, 4 schools that left you, and you take them back, you put together an 8-team conference, and you bide some time until college football decides to splinter away. But none of these plans are ideal. They're in a precarious position. So right now in the short term, it's about, can they be, like Tulane or SMU or Liberty in this year that, was the group of 5 representative in the Power 6 games or the New Year's Day games. And so I think you have, that kind of push right now in the short term at Oregon State, Washington State. But Trent Bray took it over because he was there. They trust him. They know him. He could retain some of those defensive players that were important, but less than ideal for Oregon State to booted from the Pac-12, and then Jonathan Smith leaves. Less than ideal, and they're scrapping right now and hoping that they can matter when it comes to this season, and they can beat up on those Mountain West teams that they're going to play.
It would seem regionally that the Big 12 would make more sense for those 2 schools. Was that ever, did they knock on the door of the Big 12, or was that ever a consideration seriously by the Big 12 conference?
Yeah, Oregon State and Washington State did have contact with the Big 12. There just didn't seem to be strong interest from the Big 12. Part of it was the Big 12's grant of rights, limited on them with their TV partner on how many, pro rata teams that they could add. And so once the Big 12 added, Colorado, then it took the Arizona schools, then it took Utah. I think it even had to cut a special deal with its TV partner to get permission to take Utah. There just wasn't any more money left over for Oregon State, Washington State. But I agree with you. I think Oregon State, Washington State, those college towns, they fit the Big 12. I've always said Corvallis, is kind of like a Midwestern town that's, here in the Pacific time zone. And Pullman's got that same feel to it. You're talking about, land grant universities, like a lot of the Big 12 schools. And I think there's, ideally, yeah, I think, if there's ever an opportunity to the Big 12, I think Oregon State, Washington State would go running.
Wow. Well, John, you addressed some of the stuff that we were asking about. Our last pod, we did a kind of a I don't know, a new college football playoff 101 course, so to speak, on the new format. And one thing that stuck out to us is the heavy emphasis on conference champions. So you kind of addressed this with Oregon State and Washington State. Are they now, you kind of said they basically have to try to make it as an at-large. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I think, there is a little bit of a hang up here with, the Pac-12 still has that automatic qualifier spot.
Right,
and
right.
Yeah. Schultz, the president at Washington State, is sitting on that executive board. And, I don't think they're going to be able to hold on to that. I think you kind of lose that argument for automatic qualification when there's only two of you. But I think what they're looking for there is, I think Oregon State and Washington State would love to have some kind of financial compensation from the playoff or a guarantee of revenue that maybe the group of fives don't get. I think they're looking for some kind of foothold and some kind of advantage. But I expect that they're going to be measured by the playoff committee, just like Boise State, Fresno State, Tulane, Liberty. They're going to be in that conversation. And if you really frame them that way, like Washington State, they've got a ton of momentum. They've got a good coach in Jake Dickert. I think they could come out this next season, and aside from the Washington game, they might beat Texas Tech at home. I mean, I think Washington State, that's a tough place to play. And like, you could make an argument that could be a 1 or 2 loss Washington State team, and that, Oregon State won't be bad. They'll win 8 or more, I think, in year 1 with Trent Bray. And so you start to say, like, could that be number 12 in the college football playoff ranking? And, is that a playoff team? Like, is Washington State going to get to the playoff before Washington? Like, that's a real question right now.
Sure.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, this kind of reminds me, these things have so many layers and they go back so many years. But when Nebraska ultimately made the jump to the Big Ten in 2011, or maybe the decision was made in 2010, if I'm remembering correctly. But part of the motivation for that was the very real belief that Texas was going to take half the Big 12 schools and bolt to the Pac-12. And, there's been so much that's conference shakeup since then. It's hard to keep it all straight. But, you think back to that, to where the Pac-12 is now, and your coverage, John, was really great, of all of sort of the demise of the Pac-12 and the implosion and everything that happened. So obviously we don't have time to get into all of that, but would love just kind of an overview, like, why are we here? I know it all comes back to money, but was USC and UCLA leaving? Were those like the first 2 pieces on the Jenga board that really made it like, oh my gosh, this is getting real? Or like, I know it goes back multiple commissioners, and there were some problems with the last guy. What was his name? Larry Scott?
Larry Scott.
Yeah. Kind of just curious, like, feels like this could have been avoided. Oh, there was also the story about what they get offered, $30 million per school, and they came back and said we want 50 instead, with like no in between ground. And so what were the missteps that sort of led to all this stuff that I don't think anybody, to your point, maybe it's cool for some college football rivalries, but I don't think anybody thinks this is good for college baseball or college basketball or, some of the other sports that don't get as much coverage.
Yeah, Oregon State's baseball team, they're going to compete.
Yeah.
They're going to compete as an independent. I mean, and they're going to just try to be Notre Dame in baseball. But it's really interesting because I think, I have neighbors who ask me what happened, and I summarize it this way. I think it's a total failure of leadership. The prior commissioner that you mentioned, Larry Scott, put them on the path here, negotiated a long-term media rights deal that was not in their best interest. It became outdated about midway through the contract. They weren't in quite the position that the ACC is in now, but they were in a similar predicament. And it really made USC and UCLA, the 2 LA schools that could have commanded more money, unhappy. They were unhappy. Larry Scott also negotiated downtown San Francisco headquarters for the Pac-12 conference. They paid, $11 or $12 million a year in rent. And you look at I don't know what your viewers and listeners are paying, but the Big Ten was paying about $350,000 a year in rent for their headquarters in Chicago. The SEC was paying $1 a year in rent in Birmingham because they had a donor who owned the building, gave it to the conference for $1. So you're automatically, as a conference, $10 or $11 million behind the SEC before you even look at the TV deal. Wow. So the expenses and the overhead were too much. The Pac-12 network was a great idea. It was a vision to help all of these, non-football sports thrive, and they did. I think women's college basketball in the Pac-12 is what it is because of the Pac-12 network. They could guarantee all those games were going to be on, but they didn't get distribution of the network. Fans couldn't watch it. It wasn't on DirecTV. It was a looming headache, and it created really bad feelings. And remember the Pac-12 network as you're sort of unpacking this, because not only do you have the failure of leadership of Larry Scott, his successor, they hired George Kliavkoff, who was a competent person in the world that he worked in entertainment. Really nice guy, very collegial, he's a collaborator. He's, somebody right away who went out and met with all the campuses, made everybody feel good. But he was an overcorrection from the shark that was Larry Scott, to the point where you have somebody negotiating now who maybe isn't as shrewd as you would like in that room. More of a collaborator, not an actual, point person who's going to tell the presidents, this is a bad idea. When you're offered 30 million, countering at 50 is a terrible idea. Kliavkoff did not manage the room well, and he lost that room. Now, amid that, you've got presidents and chancellors at USC and UCLA who I think were bad actors. I think that they were all along sort of, we're unhappy. Why are we sharing equally with Oregon State, Washington State, and everybody else? We've got LA. Why isn't the Pac-12 coming to us and saying, hey, what do you want? What more can we do for you? And so, when that decision that you mentioned about taking Texas and others reared its head a couple of different times, USC was one of the schools that pushed back and said, not right now. Let's not redo the deal. Let's not explore this. I think USC was already eyeing an escape to greener pastures. Then you have, on top of that, you've got pressure, this immense pressure from television. And Fox and ESPN are in competition with each other, but they also, I think, don't want competition like you're seeing in the NFL with Peacock and YouTube streaming, the Sunday Ticket. You're watching a bunch of competing forces in the NFL. And I think there was a little bit of a motivation from Fox and ESPN to keep Apple and Amazon and some others out of that space. And so right away, ESPN came in. I reported that they offered the conference $30 million per school after USC and UCLA left. Media consultant that I talked with, Bob Thompson, the former president of Fox Sports, he had predicted that they were worth about $30 million. Pac-12 should have hired him. Should have read what he was saying when I was writing about it, because he was right. They offered 30. He said they were worth about 30. He had done their deal. In fact, Thompson had done the prior deal that the Pac-12 did with Fox. So he knew. And, the fact that they didn't consult with him, the fact that they didn't manage the presidents. You had Taylor Randall, the president at Utah, who has a business background. He had a professor on his campus kind of running models. They came back and said to the other presidents, we think we're worth 50 million. They'd never done a media deal. Somebody in that room needed to raise their hand and go, look, this conference is going to end if we don't get a deal. It was October of 2022. They could have made an early deal. When they came back to ESPN at 50 million, I'm told that ESPN received that offer and then said, okay, basically, screw you, turned around to the Big 12 and offered them, they ended up settling at like 31.6 million. And so that was the money. That's all the money ESPN had. They never came back into the room. They never provided any leverage. The Pac-12 wanted some leverage with Apple and Amazon. ESPN and Fox were not going to provide it. And so you end up at the end of the rainbow with Apple, going, sure, we'll dabble in college football. We'll give you a deal that we think we can guarantee at 20 million a year. Then they went to 25. I think some of the schools really believed, and I think George Kliavkoff, if you asked him today, he believes that deal could have been worth 40 or 50 million a year to Oregon and Washington and USC or whoever wanted to be part of it. But, given that they had already been burned by the Pac-12 network experience, there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm in that room to take another risk, to bet on themselves. they'd been through it with the Pac-12 network and it didn't work out. The money wasn't there at the end of the rainbow. And so I think it was that sort of storm that really caused Oregon and Washington in particular, on that fateful morning where they decided, hey, we're out, we're going to the Big Ten. If Oregon had stayed, I think Washington would have stayed with them. And if Oregon and Washington stayed, I had sources at the Four Corners schools saying, if they stay, we'll stay. It'll be a shorter term deal. We'll do the Apple deal, but we'll stay. But when Oregon and Washington didn't have an appetite for it, and they said, we can get guaranteed money in the Big Ten, we're thinking about 10 years from now, not now. When they left, it just caused everybody to run for the hills. And it's unfortunate because, 108 years of history and tradition, boom.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow.
That's absolutely
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, John, this my next question is a little bit more of a selfish one. I'm maybe one of the few in this region that absolutely loved Pac-12 after dark. I mean, I'd get my kids to bed, my wife's to sleep, and I'll be damned if there wasn't a, Arizona and Cal are playing or something like that at 9:30 or 10 o'clock Central. So there might have been a little single tear rolling down my cheek here late November. But I guess what I'm getting at and what I want to ask you is, have you heard any rumblings about any possible Big Ten after dark or any of the traditional Pac-12 schools playing each other anymore? Because I'm sure going to miss that if I don't get that kind of that fix of late night college football anymore.
I'm here to tell you that TV is driving the bus. And there's no way that you're going to turn your TV on after the kids go to bed and there's not going to be a college football game on. They have to fill that window. And I think it's kind of funny to watch, the fan bases of the four departing schools saying, hey, we don't have to play that late game on the Pacific time zone anymore. And I'm going, you might want to check with Fox and, there's a possibility you're going to be playing in that window. And if not, the Big 12 is going to jump on it and they're going to put Arizona State, Utah in that window. And I think Oregon State and Washington State are in an interesting position too, because, their road games against the Mountain West teams will be part of the CBS, package and Fox package that the Mountain West has. But, Oregon State's got 7 home games that they can sell right now. And Washington State has 6 home games that they can sell. Now, I'm told they're going to sell them a la carte. Now, I don't think Fox or ESPN is going to buy all of them. But I will not be surprised to see tremendous interest in that Oregon State game, and Purdue, Oregon State should draw, interest from one of those TV partners. And I'm really curious to see what they will do with those other games, because it's possible that you could frequently be seeing them playing in that late window if they're put in that position. But I'm told, they're going to sell them one at a time, kind of like an a la carte offering, and try to derive as much money and exposure that they can out of those 13 games. But, I think there'll be games on. I've already heard some Big Ten people talking about Big Ten after dark, and I've heard Big 12 people talking about Big 12 after dark. Somebody's going to try to steal that brand. Let's see who gets it.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Love it.
You'll have something to go with your Saturday night bourbon, Matteo. That's for sure.
That's all I'm really looking for here, TJ.
Well, John, you've been, we kind of covered some of the issues here, and you've been so immersed in this. But I do think there's a lot of concern from longtime college football fans like us about, where this goes eventually. Like, so far, I think people have stomached NIL, the transfer portal, it feels a little bit unwieldy, but, hopefully we get some structure around some of those issues sometime soon. There's this conference realignment stuff that, you nailed it. We're not done by any means, whatever, however it plays out, we're not done. But I know there's a lot of concern among longtime college football fans that we're headed toward NFL Lite, or we're headed toward, kids having just contracts with the schools, which feels like a little bit of a different scenario. What do you think this looks like in 10 or 20 years? Like, do we ever find a place where things kind of settle into a new normal for an extended period of time? Because what we have right now are just a series of massive shocks to the system everyone's just reacting to those over and over.
Yeah, I think, psychologists will tell you that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So I think, we look at what happened from the transition from BCS to to the 4-team playoff to the 12-team playoff. This is a system that has not embraced the holistic changes that it needed to. And I think the problem has been that there isn't leadership at the top of college football. You've got this NCAA entity now led by Charlie Baker that has been in charge. And then you had the playoff kind of shoot off. Like, I was a kid, I watched Happy Days, and then Joni Meets Chachi showed up all of a sudden. And, it was a spinoff for Frasier coming out of Cheers. Another spinoff. So you've seen like the playoff is that spinoff that has become a big thing. But what we really need is we need somebody to step up. And there are some good ideas out there. Chip Kelly's not dumb for he's a visionary guy. He threw out a great idea about the separation of major college football that I think would really help everybody else and would settle down. That Nebraska volleyball team needs to be playing in a regional conference, and Oregon's volleyball team doesn't need to be playing against Maryland. Like, it just doesn't make any sense for that to happen. And so I think you have football splintering away, but that's going to require like somebody being in charge, and that somebody I think is probably somebody like Greg Sankey, the SEC commissioner. But you need to college football to step back and go, look, where do we want to be, and let's not take 50 years to get there. Let's do this in a more dramatic sweep. Like, it's turned into big business. A big business decision needs to be made. And so, my fear is that we're going to see this done in increments, and the increments are going to kill the game and kill the sport and kill the spirit of college football. And I think it's a real fear right now, because it is looking like the NFL Lite. And in fact, I was at the college football playoff title game, and it felt like an NFL championship game. And I thought, gosh, does this thing need to be the Super Bowl? We already have the Super Bowl. Like, I'm looking for Taylor Swift in a suite. Like, what's going, Michael Jordan shows up and Derek Jeter. And I was just like, but I like looking around the stadiums and seeing fans there still. It's not sell it out as a corporate thing. I think the playoff expansion is going to be good. I think this is going to be a good era for competition. But yeah, there are real concerns about, like, how do you get to what we all know should happen, which is 48 or 64 of the top programs in the country should just be playing football, and it should stay college football, and there should be more restrictions around NIL, transparency. We should all know what the quarterback at Oregon is getting. We should all know what the market rate. I talked to an SEC athletic director who told me that the agents are lying about what the players are getting. Nobody really knows what the players are getting. So the SEC athletic director has to call a Pac-12 AD and go, hey, this is what our collective's offering. What are you guys offering? And they're fact-checking each other right now. There should just be a database where we're all able to look in and go, oh, Caleb Williams made $4 million. That's what, what Shedeur Sanders getting at Colorado. So I think we need regulation on the portal. I'm fine with players earning. The market should dictate what they're worth. But I think that transparency will go a long way towards motivating fan bases, certainly. But I also think it would go a long way towards leveling that playing field, because right now, like, what is Oregon spending? And how many extra scholarships does Dan Lanning at Oregon have versus, the Big Ten teams they're going to play against next year? Nobody knows. And I think it's a dangerous position to be in. But ultimately, yeah, college football needs leadership. It's the same thing that killed the Pac-12. If college football is not careful and they just sell out to TV without anybody having a voice and going, hey, this has still got to be college football. It's got to be about the campuses. We got to retain the history of some of these bowl games that matter. You're going to lose all that. And it's all going to be one big television production with ESPN and Fox owning it.
Wow. Spot on. Great stuff, John. Thank you. Well, you've been more than generous with your time. If you have time for one more question, we mentioned Trent Bray. There's actually quite a few Oregon, Nebraska connections, and you're a Pac-12 guy, but been based in Oregon for a long time. So, we had Mike Riley leaving OSU to coach the Huskers. Obviously, Scott Frost was Oregon's offensive coordinator before he became a head coach. Dana Altman still at Oregon, all these things. Do you have any good, Riley and Frost in particular, do you have any good, Riley or Frost stories or anything you can share with us? Or have you talked to either of those guys since they left Nebraska, for that matter?
Yeah, I'm surprised that both didn't work out for different reasons. Like, I thought Mike Riley, he's had success being a builder everywhere he's gone. And, part of the problem with Riley's tenure at Nebraska, I think, was I wonder if he was running from Oregon State instead of running to Nebraska. I know he was feeling unappreciated. I've talked to him about, sort of the lack of appreciation that he felt at Oregon State. Keep in mind, that was a program that had not been to a bowl game in 28 years. He set the stage for Dennis Erickson's rise. Then he came back and, in a 3-year period, Mike Riley won 29 games at Oregon State. It was, remarkable that he was, in the Chip Kelly era. Riley and Kelly had some, had a civil war that was played for the right to go to the Rose Bowl. He had resurrected the program, and I think he felt unappreciated, and he sort of blew town in the cover of night, and I think he was running away from Corvallis as much as anything, and I think that's a wrong reason to do anything when you are a college football coach. I kind of worry about Jonathan Smith doing that a little bit with Michigan State. I think if he had been more patient, he would have ended up with a better job. Think about, had he stayed just at Oregon State, would he be the coach at Washington now? Would he have been a candidate at Michigan? I don't, Michigan State we all know what that job is in the Big Ten. It's not the best job. But so I think Riley was running away from Oregon State, and I think that really hurt him. I also think, the Scott Frost thing, just really interesting to me because the guy was dynamic at Oregon and had a great reputation at Oregon. And then, got to Nebraska, and I sometimes I want to chalk that one up as sometimes a good coordinator does not make a good head coach. Yeah. There are duties that you have to do as the CEO of the program, presenting yourself to boosters, doing media appearances that didn't fit Scott Frost's best, his best skill set. And I think, you have other coaches who are just fantastic CEOs. You can put them in a room with boosters. They know where the money's buried. They're going to do great in that situation, but they're smart enough and have, enough self-awareness to hire great coordinators. I think Frost is a coordinator and a recruiter, not a head coach. And I think Mike Riley, it just wasn't the right time. I think, you got him earlier in Nebraska, I think he would have won more. And I just wonder at that point, he was obviously we now know, dealing with, some health issues with his wife. There was tremendous distraction there. And, I've written about that. She's in memory care now. And I think that was going on in the background as he was trying to sort of assimilate himself and join the culture and the family that was Nebraska football. And it just wasn't a good fit.
Yeah. The Frost thing will never just not be shocking, I think, to a lot of us that it didn't work out and that they never even got to a bowl game. Remember, he did have the success at UCF as a head coach before coming to Nebraska.
That's true.
But I do think, coming home to where he grew up and where he was a star quarterback, I do wonder if after, it didn't, after year two, year one's the transition year two, I think that staff really thought things were going to take off, and then it didn't. And I kind of have wondered if that was a bit of a turning point where I think everything you said is accurate too, but I think I wonder if that was a big turning point of like the gravity of the situation maybe started to cave in on him a little bit.
That too. And let's not forget, the job was changing right around that time. And, we now can see back, right? We're on a plane that's leaving the runway and we're looking down at the town we're leaving. And you can kind of see back and go, gosh, maybe Nebraska the infrastructure at Nebraska wasn't ideally set up either at that time. And is it a better job now than it was when Frost took it or Mike Riley took it? Because Nebraska obviously was trying to make this big transition and was struggling with it, and so would it have mattered? Like, would Vince Lombardi have struggled? I don't know. Like Bill Belichick, would he have struggled in that situation? I think it's fair to ask that because even, recently this popped up on my radar because, Nick Saban leaves Alabama. And we know Nick Saban's not leaving that job if he thinks he can win and win and win like he's always won. He had to have looked around and said, I made the playoff. This is a good time for me to go. I lost the advantage that gives me the best team. I'm going to struggle in this. He was complaining about NIL in the portal nonstop. I had a coach in the ACC who told me, look, there were some conferences who have done NIL forever. Now everybody's doing it.
Yeah.
I kind of just think jobs change sometimes. And like Kalen DeBoer is going to take that Alabama job. It's not the same job that Nick Saban had 5, 7, 10 years ago. And I kind of just wonder if, he struggles, everyone's going to point at him and go, "Oh, you aren't Nick Saban. You're Frank Sinatra Jr. You're a bum." And the truth is, it's just a harder job. And Nick Saban wouldn't have left it if, David Shaw ran, and here he is interviewing for NFL jobs. There are just some coaches, it raises some red flags. These jobs are changing. Oregon, Dan Lanning says the grass is greener. I think he's literally going, I've got a better NIL collective than most every school. Why the heck would I want to go to Alabama or anywhere else? Yep. It's just the ecosystem has shifted, and you got to be mindful of that. It was shifting when Mike Riley was there. It was shifting when Scott Frost was there. As a fan, if you're a Nebraska fan, what do you do now? If you're fired up, you better give to that collective. I mean, that's the name of the game.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you're spot on too. Both of them, I think, there were issues beyond their control, both at the administration at the school and the athletic department. There's been some instability there for a long time, and hopefully we have righted the ship, or we are righting the ship in that regard too. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, we'll do this, right? We got to learn. You got to learn from your history and your mistakes, or you just don't get better. And and continuity matters. The coaching changes. You don't want to change head coaches. That continuity is devastating to a program and the momentum. And so, Kyle Whittingham at Utah, part of his magic is that Utah stuck with him when he had some bad seasons. So you got to know that too, as impatient as we all are.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is fantastic stuff, John. Matteo, do you have any other questions?
No, but I just want to say this has been great, John. Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys.
Really appreciate you joining us, and Common fans, make sure to check out johncanzano.com. Sign up, subscribe for the email newsletter. Find him on Twitter. Will be a great follow now with all the new teams coming to the Big Ten. Thanks for listening, Husker fans. As always, GBR for life.